Breath attack. So a lot of people understand how to tech the regulators. Not a lot of people truly understand exactly how a paintball regulator works. There actually isn't that much literature out there on it. It's not really easy to find on the internet. You actually have to go under like scuba regulators in order to get a really good explanation of exactly how they work. But what we're going to do today is we're going to go over one regulator, and then I'll go briefly over some of the other manufacturers' regulators to just kind of explain in a nutshell exactly why you should know this kind of stuff and how it applies to teching your regulator and troubleshooting. But we're going to start with the MacDev Reg, and the reason why we'll start with this one is because it's just kind of nice and cut out. The actual sleeve that seals everything is milled into the grip frame of the MacDev guns. So it's just kind of easily laid out, and we'll be able to go over the various different components, and I can show you. But to start off, the way this particular reg works, air comes through the bottom of the regulator, then it travels up this little hole in the piston, through the piston, into this little chamber above it. And the piston is at the bottom of that chamber. And as air passes through that little hole in the piston, it builds up here slowly, PSI by PSI. And as the pressure builds in that chamber, it starts to press the regulator piston down. And the only thing stopping it from going down is the tension provided by the spring. But as the pressure builds, it eventually overcomes that tension of the spring and presses the piston all the way down until it comes in contact with this part at the bottom called the reg seat. And that reg seat, as you notice, is a larger diameter than the hole in the piston, and it's flush. And as it comes into contact with that, it actually shuts off the air supply going into the reg. So since that hole is plugged in the piston, no more air pressure can build on the upside of this piston. So the only thing that is really stopping this piston from closing off is the spring tension. And the way a regulator adjusts a certain PSI of air pressure is, so let's say this spring takes 168 pounds to compress all the way to where the piston is touching that reg seat. That means that there's 168 pounds of pressure on the upside of this regulator piston. That's the actual pressure that's going into the gun. So that is how it actually works. And the way that you adjust the pressure is by adjusting the amount of spring tension that's holding the piston back. So if you have less spring tension, it takes less PSI to press the piston down, which means there's going to be less PSI stored on top of there because it shuts itself off right after. No more pressure can build. If you want more PSI going into your gun, then you want more spring tension because more pressure has to build inside that chamber in order to compress the spring to where the reg shuts itself off again. So the best description of a paintball regulator I could come up with is it's a valve that always wants to shut itself off. It will always shut itself off. It's just a matter of how much pressure that builds above it that takes to shut it off. And there's two different ways that you can adjust the tension for the spring on a regulator, and that covers most of the regulators in paintball. And that's either by adjusting the distance between the reg seat and the top or the bottom of the piston, or by turning a screw like in a bob-long regulator. So you can see the actual spring pack is at the bottom of the regulator where the hole is. When you're turning this in to turn it up, to turn the PSI up, you're actually compressing the spring pack, which is giving you more resistance. But in this MacDev regulator, it has that adjustable reg seat where you're moving it up and down. So when I turn this in, if you have a basic understanding of how springs work, the less you compress it, say I'm trying to compress it 1/8 of an inch, it takes less force than if I was trying to compress it, say 1/2 an inch. So if you're only compressing this 1/8 of an inch, if I turn this reg seat, let me unscrew this here so you can see. So if I screw this reg seat all the way in to where it's a shorter distance between the two, I only have to compress that spring pack about 1/8 of an inch, which means I have to have less pressure in order to meet the two parts together and shut the reg off. Now if I back this all the way out, I have to compress the spring, say 1/2 inch, and that would mean that I have to have way more pressure in order to fully compress that spring that's going to be stored on top of the regulator. And You know, a lot of people think of regulators as this kind of continuous air supply, how there's always air pressure flowing through them, but that's just not how it works. It stores individual shots, individual reservoirs of pressurized air in a chamber above it. So every time the gun shoots, that pressure leaves. There's no more pressure above the piston, so the spring pushes the piston right back up, which opens that valve again, and then pressure is allowed to go back inside the regulator and depress the piston again and shut the reg off again. Then you have another stored shot, and this all happens in fractions of a second. And when you're shooting a gun on ramp, it's happening, you know, many times. And that's basically how they work. Very, very, very simple devices. It's a valve that always wants to shut itself off. So why does this apply? Well, why should I know this? Why did I just listen and be drone on about it for however long that took? Once you understand the basic principles of how one regulator works, you can pretty much apply it all the way across. If you look across the different regs here, Eclipse regulators, they all basically have the same components. You have your reg seat inside here, you have your piston, you have your spring. Same with your Lux regulators. If you look at the internals of them, you have your piston, your spring, your reg seat. On the Lux regs, it's actually on the inside of the piston. If you look at your Bob Long regs, it's basically the same thing. They use a Schrader valve instead of a reg seat, which is very, very similar, does the same job. And on the Hyper 2s, same thing. They use a shim pack instead of springs, which I know a lot of you people have dealt with and hate, because you end up losing a lot of those shims. But once you understand how they're stacked and you're careful about taking your reg apart, they work really well. They last a little bit longer than springs do, so they can be better. So how does this apply to teching regulators? So there are three basic problems you'll have with regs. You'll have them creeping on you, which means they creep to a higher pressure than what they're set at, so they just continuously build pressure and supercharge your gun with way too much pressure than what was recommended. And then you'll have little leaks through the bleed hole in a particular reg, which almost all regs, I think all regs do have bleed holes, yes. And then you'll have just overall inconsistency for a particular regulator. So when you're talking about leaks through the bleed hole, this little area where the spring sits, there's no pressure in there. There should not be pressure in there. That's why there's a hole in it to let you know when there is some kind of pressure leaking into there. And when you have that leak, that means that either this O-ring, the O-ring that seals all that pressure that's pressing that piston down, has a cut in it or has some kind of imperfection in it that's letting air pass through it, or the little O-ring that seals this piston to the body. So remember, your air pressure is going through that little hole. There's also an O-ring that fits perfectly around here that stops air pressure from going around the hole. So on every reg, they have one of these little O-rings, and like see on the Eclipse O-ring here, an Eclipse reg here, it's sitting right inside there, and you can see how it kind of perfectly fits the piston. And on your MacDev regs, it's the same thing. You have that little O-ring inside there. The piston perfectly seats around that, sealing that spring pack off from air coming in that way and air coming in the other opposite direction. On your Hyper 2s, it's the exact same thing. There's an O-ring inside there that fits around that piston. So those are your two O-rings to check. Those are the two ones to replace, and if you replace the easy one to get to, the one that's around the piston, and you still have a leak, then you'll know that it's got to be that O-ring on the inside that's sealing the actual stem of the piston. When it comes to supercharging, remember the thing that shuts the regulator off, the thing that stops more pressure from being built in the regulator, is the reg seat. So if you're having a problem where your gun is supercharging, where you have reg creep, most likely it is because that reg seat is damaged and is allowing air to continue to feed through that hole in the piston into that little cavity above. And most of the time, if you have the wafer variety of reg seat, you can just flip it over and you'll have a nice flush face again, as long as your piston isn't damaged, as long as that isn't the reason. If this has a chip in it or if it's bent, then it won't seal properly to any reg seat and you have to replace that. So the last issue you'll have with regs has to do with consistency. And remember, the thing that dictates the PSI of your reg, the output pressure of it, is your ability of your piston to move back and forth freely. So if you have a bad O-ring in here, if you have an O-ring that is improperly lubed, there's not enough lube on it, or there's not the right type of lube, or you have a bunch of dirt that is kind of built up in there, it will stop the piston from moving like it should, and it will take less or more pressure in order to depress the piston, which means you'll get different PSIs in between each time this piston goes up and down. So it'll move down, shut off the reg, then pop back up, and then some of that grit will make it close a little bit slower or provide a little bit more resistance for that next shot, and then you'll get a different PSI going into your gun, which gives you a different velocity, a different feet per second on the shot. So relube it, change the O-ring, pop it back in, and it should be fixed. The only time you can't do a quick fix like that is if the piston is just bad, if it's warped, or if there's some kind of issue where you just have to completely replace the piston. But so that pretty much covers all the individual issues you'll have with regulators and how they work. If you have any particular questions about a specific regulator or want me to go into more detail about a particular regulator, please leave your questions in the comments below. If you found the video helpful, please hit the little like button. And if you want to see more, remember to subscribe. And we'll see you next time.